The resurrection from the dead. The biblical narrative accounts of what looks like a resurrection is supposed to happen. And there's a group called full preterists. Full preterists believe that the resurrection from the dead actually happened in our past, in actual history. But there's also another group called Israel Only. And a lot of them are full preterist. And they believe that it actually happened as well. Today we're going to be speaking with David King. David King actually is an Israel-only full preterist, yet he thinks this is just a story. And according to the story, it looks as though full preterism, the resurrection from the dead, all that stuff happened according to the narrative. I know it sounds a bit confusing, but you'll get to hear me and him dialogue back and forth. There's an interesting part in the New Testament where there's two guys, Hymenaeus and Philetus, who believed that the resurrection had already happened. Now, how could that be? I mean, if they were anticipating a universal resurrection as the church espouses, how could someone really run around teaching that and people are falling for it? Just doesn't make sense to me. I hope you guys stay tuned or as piqued with your interest as I am on this discussion that I had with David King. We'll see you there, and don't forget to subscribe to his channel. Okay, you're IO.
Right.
You think full preterism is a more valid...
No-brainer.
Okay,
Yes.
no brainer. Now,
Mhm.
when you say full preterism, you're not saying actually like a physical resurrection happened, right? You define that differently.
It can be both. It doesn't have to be either or.
Okay, and when you say both, when you say physical, what kind of resurrection is that?
In a physical resurrection. So you had Paul, I think it's First Thessalonians 4, was talking about the dead rising first and then the rest. And they were all going to go to the place that Jesus ascended to. You know, it's kind of to summarize all of that. So that would have been your physical. The spiritual would be Paul's point of view on the death brought by the old covenant. And then so I once was dead in trespasses against the old covenant, but now I'm alive in Christ in the new covenant. I should say now I'm a new covenant Israelite
New
from the
creation,
first century
right?
that's alive. Yeah. So I was an old creation, Israelite under the old covenant. That creation where there's a motif there that speaks about the old covenant, and the new creation is going from old to new. And then you had a falling from grace. That meant that they were falling from the new covenant and going back to the old covenant, going back to the law. So these contexts are super small. They're not a global, context.
Which is like only found in Israel only, group that you hear, except some scholars like here and there might touch on it barely, and they never really drive it home because it's not relevant to the bigger topic of hand, Christianity, the church, which is something that's like you guys are saying is built on something completely different, the way that they've done things. You said the dead rise first. Now, here's why I've been saying, and I was full preterist. You know that. I was like hardcore full preterist. I believed all these things actually happened physically or spiritually, however you want to define it, because I actually thought it was spiritual in nature, like wholeheartedly. I
Yeah.
saw relevance of, Jesus was rising again, but I could never make sense because as I was a full preterist, I'm hearing Ward Finley and other, Don K. Preston, and everybody's disputing. Don K. Preston says Jesus, when he ascended on high, he cast off his body. The church says, no, this is what is the terminology where he's completely God and completely man at the same time. And there's like it's a doctrine in the church where it's
kind of the standard.
It's an actual doctrinal theological term where he's completely God and completely man at the same time. So he has his flesh. Okay. He's still in his flesh. And I said, well, dang. And Don K. Preston says, well, he threw off his flesh. All right. When he went up, he just, whatever that means, somewhere put aside. It just doesn't matter anymore, whatever. And then you have others who came on and says completely spiritual. And then you had others like Rivers of Eden come on and go, nope, physical. And these are people you probably have no clue who I'm talking about, guys. this is within preterism. Okay. When I started realizing, okay, guys don't walk on water and dead people don't rise and fish don't swallow people, take them down into the belly of the sea or beneath all the waters and they survive 3 days later, or seas don't split, even though your documentaries will try and give you natural causes for why the plagues of Egypt even happened, or donkeys don't talk, snakes don't talk, right? You see it's allegory, or you see that there's literature here that might be not literal. When you get into the New Testament, though, this is where it gets interesting. Everyone has dominated the scene saying Jesus had to rise again from the dead. And I try to spiritualize that as much as possible for me. And the closest I could come is that if Paul's teaching a spiritual resurrection, then he's saying if there was a guy named Jesus, he spiritually rose from the dead. In some way, he rose again with a new body. If he did not, and this is physical, I call bullshit. And that's why I'm not a full preterist. Not saying this stuff wasn't supposed to happen then, but I'm like, whether or not, what's he mean? What does this guy even mean that Jesus rose? Because he says, if he did not rise, we are still in our sins. He acted like everything's bogus, BS. And even Paul admits it, right?
Yeah, I'm going to bring up a YouTube video that's almost an hour long that Ryan McKittrick did on 4 different resurrection concepts all together. So that's why I say it could be both, and then it makes sense that it would be both.
When you say both,
this
is why I'm trying to drive home, though. When you say it's both, do you mean physical, literal physical bodies dead that rise? In the concept. Now, I know you're not a believer. I'm just saying, like, do you understand where I'm coming from? Like, is the text trying to say that? Because if it's saying that literal dead bodies are supposed to rise, literal physical flesh bodies are supposed to resurrect from the dead, this is why I say, that didn't really happen. Therefore, it isn't an actual prophecy. Like Jesus said, this temple will be destroyed and will rise again. And then, of course, one of the Gospels says, well, he was talking about his body. Now, the actual temple did fall, and we know the gospel narratives, the synoptics are clearly indicating the temple destroyed. Josephus validates this. Other historians who are non-Christian validate this. And they all tell, hey, that shit went down. But there are other claims that Jesus rose from the dead physically or spiritually. That's up for grabs. However, if he rose physically, that would mean the saints are going to rise physically, which then makes it go, if it's full preterism, that means the saints already rose from the dead. To me, it's like none of that actually happened. So I can't say fulfillment in that aspect happened. Someone might say, hey, this is spiritual, Hymenaeus and Philetus kind of idea, hint, hint. I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there that the only way full preterism would make sense to me is if the author's intent was not physical, to me, and it was actually spiritual in nature. Then it's like, hey, they had some wackadoodle spiritual concept they applied to resurrection and said it happened. You say it's physical, and then it's like, what do you mean bodies rose from the dead? You know what I mean? I'm just...
Yeah, I think the texts are written that it's supposed to be both, whether it happened or not.
Okay.
And so like Ed Stevens is a full preterist that believes in a rapture in the first century. And I can see why. I totally see why they would take rapture. So it's like you've got a blend of all of it. So you can't say, like, if we're talking about full preterism, you can't say that it's one stance, when it comes to the conclusion. There are many conclusions,
Right.
but their conclusion is that it's all fulfilled in the first century, so that 4 resurrection concepts in scripture, on the Israel Only Information YouTube channel, you'll see this black logo with IO inside of it. There's a YouTube video there, the 4 resurrection concepts in scripture. It's 44 minutes long. Ryan, I think, kills it. I think he does a great job showing that there are 4 different motifs there, all about resurrection.
Okay. Yeah, and you brought up a valid point, something interesting, and this is what I've been saying for about, I don't know, since I've had Dr. Price on my show, is all of these teachings could be in the New Testament. I'm saying they don't necessarily have to be the same. Okay, Paul might be teaching a certain kind of resurrection.
James is probably teaching something this is the point. They can all be true if you try to somehow make all books fit, if you try. And I'm trying to say these critical scholars are saying, nice try, buddy, but this isn't going to all make sense. It doesn't all fit together. One of them's teaching this kind of resurrection, or one of them's teaching a certain type of concept that is not the same. Their theories of, grace through faith or based off works, and faith and works together, and not grace and faith alone, like Paul. And there's so much that's different that like what Christians have done to try and make sense of it is they say, and this is what happened early on, they all try to make it say, hey, stop. It's okay. It's okay. You're an Edomite Jew. You believe that Torah still stands. That's okay. I know Paul doesn't agree with that, so we'll write a gospel that makes sure that you can still obey the law and be a good Christian who's still Platonic in nature, who believes in some otherworldly realm possibly, and combine the two. And scholars are saying early Christianity started taking these different kinds of Christianities, one with physical resurrection, one with spiritual resurrection, possibly the other two that this guy's talking about, and I need to check them out. I've seen them on Facebook. And they blended them and literally created a hodgepodge of theology. So if it's right for you, it's there. So anyone who has these concepts can go to this book and go, bless you. My teachings are right there. It's, part of what my master, whether that's a Gnostic master kind of concept or a Gnostic teaching, might be in there, or, hey, it might be more Catholic in nature. It might be more Jewish in nature, and you can go and find it there. And that, and they did a good job trying to, but if you really take a magnifying glass, these critical scholars are going, hey guys, read my book. You'll see some issues, and these are things we want to point out. I think personally, what preterism has done, I want your opinion. Full preterism has told me it has to happen then. What it's done is very clearly tell me this stuff's supposed to happen very soon. Like, it has to. But it's also helped me go, nice try. Like, this didn't actually happen if it's this. So technically, yeah.
With that theory, you'll be thinking just like any other advanced scholar, just like Bart Ehrman, Jesus was an apocalyptic teacher.
Right.
He came during a time that an apocalypse was coming and everything was going to end. So that's what the story's about, and the fact that it didn't end the way, the early church expected it to, that's why terms were redefined. So instead of a judgment that was coming to Old Covenant Israel in AD 70, which is what actually happened, okay, well, now judgment is something that happens to everybody when they die, it's all in the afterlife. But everything switches to the afterlife. Eternal life. It's no longer this age that's coming. After AD 70, everything's going to be totally different, and there's going to be this age, and we all inherit all these things, and everything's wonderful, and we can rule the world from our instead of that. Well, it didn't happen that way. So now eternal life is in the afterlife, and it's up in heaven somewhere.
Right.
So it's like this horizontal axis was shifted, and so now everything is in the afterlife. It's all up in heaven, or it's down in hell, judgment. And so we rephrase this like unquenchable fire and the judgment and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's what would happen when a city was destroyed. Right. Unquenchable meaning that you don't put the fire out until it burns everything up. When a city is burning up, you can't stop that fire. It's
Sodom and Gomorrah.
It's inspired by God. It's going to totally burn everything up. There's no way to stop it. It's not eternal conscious torment like that. But for this early church, when they read, those kinds of words, they're like, oh, well, that's the afterlife. That they didn't actually have the word hell until like the 8th century AD. So they were using other, the Gehenna and the other words to describe this afterlife, experience. And then you've got the apocalypse of Peter coming out and stuff, and getting super creative with those afterlife concepts. So that's all early church chaos, in my opinion. But the original story was horizontal timeline. Jesus comes on the line. Stuff's coming to this generation, and then after that, those who survive are going to get all this reward. And then this age to come that starts in 80, 70 or whenever, it's going to be amazing, And so you've got some Israel only full preterists that are like, they're going into the afterlife, and it was a rapture, and and so they're getting all those promises there elsewhere, where we can't prove a damn thing. Everything is elsewhere. So,
What do you
but
think? Oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead. You're
I was
good.
going to ask you, what do you think Jesus meant when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world"? What do you think he means? Like old covenant world, and then it's a new covenant world. But why would he tell that to Pontius Pilate? Like, do you kind of get where I'm going? Like, why would that even be mentioned? I only tell you what scholars are saying, right? Because this is the thing. I don't give a crap what what you say or what you say in terms of like if you're trying to tell me what it is. I like to gather information. And there's the idea of Philo. Philo was an Alexandrian Jew. He was super Platonic in nature. Platonic meant that
Yeah,
technically, to give you a simple term, duality is the idea that the flesh is evil and the spirit realm is this idea of like get rid of the body kind of
Platonism.
idea.
Yeah,
Right. And
the
they,
soul is kind of where our modern concepts of soul came from.
right. And that's where the
Platonism. Yeah,
church took this like hook, line, and sinker. The church really drove this to the core. And maybe there was an earlier sense Edomite type or some type of Christianity that wasn't as Platonic and more Jewish like, but and I don't know how true that is, just throwing it out there that it might be. But that's where this idea the church is saying when Jesus is saying my my kingdom's not of this world. He's a king of another world. Like most scholars, Bart Ehrman, Dr. Price, these guys, they'll say, hey, there's clear evidence that he's actually saying he's not going to reign in this world. Like he's not going to be the Messiah king ruling from an earthly throne, but rather some other worldly realm. And I'm just throwing it out there, and I see why they say it. But shit, that doesn't mean that your concept's not even being taught in other places as well. Or does it define this? And does it have to define this? Can this still stand and be true based on Platonic duality, etc., and yet the other interpretation that you're giving be true in other places? I don't know.
yeah. So two different answers on that. It can be either or. So it's either Jesus speaking. So elsewhere where cosmos is used in the New Testament, most times it's speaking of the old covenant world. It's not speaking of just secularism, or the Romans and all that kind of stuff. It's just old covenant world. It's kind of, and that's the word cosmos. So that kind of shows you the imagery of old creation, new creation. It's all covenant language, right?
Right.
So when Jesus says that, he could be speaking of that, or he can be just of secular everything world. And he was serious. It's in a whole different area. So there isn't a black and white answer for that. For me, that's a great question. And there's really, I don't think we'll ever really know for sure. But I have a good case together about cosmos being used in covenant language, just the old covenant world and the new creation being created. Speaking of the new covenant people, Yahweh's new covenant people.
And I'd like to see more of this. You do a lot of that. I for those of you who are watching, I'm going to bring more of this on. Of course, I'm not just going to bring Israel only stuff. I want to bring other scholars. I've got a show to do tomorrow with Dr. Price in the morning, and I'm excited because we're going to talk
Nice.
about the Old Testament. And I know you're going to do shows with him. I am a huge fan of unity. Okay. I know Christians, okay, they're not fundamentalists, but they're Christians who love me to death. Okay. And they love my show. They're like, dude, I watch your show and I love it. And I'm like, really? And
Really?
yes, I'm not even kidding. Because I'm going to tell you something. Screw all this. This is awesome and fun. I love humans, man. Like I really care.
Yeah.
And I know
Same.
what it's like to be stuck in a mindset or an idea. If that's all you know, or it's something that gives you hope, I'm not here to tear you down. But I will tell you, if you're willing to kind of open up and say, okay, who the hell is Celsus? What did he write? And what do you mean? I never even heard of a guy named Celsus. Oh, he's a pagan in the 3rd century who's actually debating church fathers, telling them that they don't know who their Jesus is, that their Jesus was born from a Roman soldier sleeping with Mary. His name was Pandarus or something, Pandarus. And he pretty much was talking about how this Jesus taught his followers to be beggars, like literally taught them to beg for money and all this stuff, right? And I'm like, what? So he might be completely biased and just talking crap against the Christians and making up stuff about Jesus. But have you ever really unbiasedly sat in the middle and said, what do the believers say? What are the pagans saying? What are other people talking about Jesus? And that's what you're doing too, but you're doing something unique because nobody else is actually taking this approach you're taking that I'm aware of with
Yeah.
full preterism in mind. And do you understand like why I'm skeptical now of being a full preterist at all? Because like if anything physical, if there's a claim, let me just give you an example. Let's say Paul meant physical. All right, let's just say yes, spiritual and physical. Let's say both, right? Let's say he's saying spiritual, physical. And let's say someone actually died and they're actually supposed to rise from the dead within a certain context. First of all, I don't believe Jesus actually rose from the dead if he existed. I think if he died, he's dead. He never rose. Cognitive dissonance would be the best case, in my opinion, if he really existed. And that would be along the lines of Bart Ehrman, et cetera, saying, look, dude, there was no empty tomb because he was dead. And they had imaged him or pictured him or experienced him after his death, like 15% of healthy people do of their loved ones when they pass. So they had this post-mortem experience. If he didn't rise and the saints are supposed to rise like him, that I can't even like wrestle this, because it's like, to me, it's like obvious it didn't happen. If it's saying it's physical, it didn't happen to me. That's just where I'm at, unless I'm
Yeah.
defining physical different. You see what I'm saying? Unless you mean physical, like, I don't know how you could say it's physical. That's what I'm saying. I don't know.
Yeah, it would be easy. It would be easy for the story to actually be saying, that what happened to Jesus, all of his experiences, what's going to happen to his followers, And so we see Jesus ascend and he goes up into this otherworldly place. And we know that he went up somewhere. He didn't just like leave because, where did he go? Right. He went somewhere and
Right.
they're looking up, whenever. And so they were all going to go somewhere else. So the idea of a rapture, as far as the story goes, what is the
Right.
narrative actually saying? It could be supporting that, an actual rapture that they all went
Just
up
the
somewhere.
story.
The story, and that's why I'm
Right.
saying, like, for people that believe that it's a myth, it works really well that way, it being seen as a fable and as a myth. Because I believe it excludes the early church believers. I believe it excludes the modern church. The texts themselves do that. Yeah, go ahead.
No,
Talk over
no,
that.
no. I can't. Why would I interrupt
I can
that?
just keep going, man. I
That
don't
is
know.
good.
Yeah,
That is
yeah.
good. I
Okay.
enjoy that. Yeah, please do. I like where you went with the rapture. Um, I asked Dr. Bob one time, and I'd love to get him back on the show to talk about this. Maybe he knows more. He mentioned there's only one other religious worldview or myth that has something like a rapture happen. Or maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe he says
Really?
there's many. No, he said there's only one where I think there's a collective group. Okay. But I think many type of apotheosis concepts of dying gods being ascended, etc., that happens like a lot, from Osiris to you name it type, deities, that there's like an apotheosis that takes place. Romulus, I think, happens, and most scholars say he never existed. And this is why I like bringing the heavy hitters like him on, because, hey, look, maybe we'll marry these ideas at some point and find a way where
Yeah.
they blend. And that's why I freaking do what I do, bro. And I'm not going to give up.
Mhm.
But I don't want my old friends to be, dude, they're in the minority, bro. I'm an underdog cheerer, okay? Like if you're at a football game, I don't have a
Yeah.
team, but if the weak team is going up against a good team, I hope to see something shocking, So I'm
Mhm.
interested in that. If this is just a story, why would they write it? Just to I guess what I'm saying is, if 70 AD is the end, they're putting an end cap to the whole story. They're trying to say, look, Israel's story's ended. It's done. They're raptured. They're in their promised land. They're in the New Jerusalem, in the 144 cubit measurements, which is funny because it actually is tying off of, there's similar measurements to the cube that's used in the story with Enki, the god Enki, and Gilgamesh, way back in the day. And they're using similar numerical values and stuff. If it is ended and it's wrapping up, someone's writing their stories got an end. and I know there's not like a way to really answer this. It's just complete hunch. Why would they lie?
Exactly.
What do you think? What's your guess?
Well, realistically, we had the demise of a people, and so if somebody wanted to write about the last of the Mohicans, they could wrap it up that way if they'd like. And then if that's the case, if that was the original case, then maybe you have layers that came after that, people revising, changing it, adding themselves to it, but I still feel like the original texts themselves, like what we have today, excludes everybody else, which is strange because then you have the early church, then you have a evangelic religion that comes out of it where they're going and they're talking to everyone and their mother about joining this religion, and I believe the texts actually exclude everybody else. So there's a whole concept of like in modern Christianity, it's called Calvinism. And you were a Calvinist when you were a
Yeah.
believer, and you had predestination, you had all that kind of stuff. Well, I don't see that anywhere in the church until what, the 1500s. We finally start seeing that come to light. There's a lot that seemed to come out, like there's a lot that came out maybe 500 years ago that we take as common sense today. They never had for almost 1500 years.
I know that, and I wrote a lecture on this back in my Bible college that I was getting my bachelor's degree in biblical studies and theology. Ooh, as a biased fundamentalist Christian, but I was Calvinist at the time, and what inspired me was John Calvin and other scholars. That if you go back to Augustine, now Augustine did delve into predestination. There's concepts within these theologies and
Okay.
groups, and you have predestination, and you have double predestination. And there was a church father, but he comes after Augustine, and he held to a double predestination idea. And simply put, within Calvinism and different, I became a staunch hyper Calvinist. I became a Calvinist who said, look, I'm not going to soft it for you. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm not going to play games. I'm going to tell you that God purposefully made Adam fall. Like he not only causes all things, he did so according to his good will and purpose. And the whole goal was to Romans 9, right? Like the idea was that he had a vessel, special vessels, and there were common vessels. The common vessels will be thrown away. Dude, I was willing
Vessels
to
of
hook 'em.
wrath. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just crazy, dude. But I believed
Yeah.
that you couldn't get around it as a Calvinist. Like, how do you let God? Oh, and they have this idea that evil's the lack of something. So they borrowed ideas that, well, he's not really guilty of sin. James, the book of James, clearly is trying to protect God from ever having his hands touching sin. So we have to back up. And they use similar ideas like where he sends a lying spirit, an angel. He sends a lying spirit in the Old Testament, but he himself didn't lie. Yet it's like, if you look at 1 Samuel and you look at the other place where David's numbering the people, and you had Satan in one place, but you have God in the next place, makes me kind of like, why is Job, for example, like he sends Satan to test Job, but really God sent him. Do you forget? I don't even.
He was an agent.
Right.
Yeah, he was an agent. Yeah.
But it all comes from God.
And then
to
that
do
evolves.
it. That's all I'm saying is like Calvinism to me like showed that God was completely, if he is sending Satan as an agent even. Okay. And I think the thought of maybe Satan has evolved too, even into the New Testament. There's an evolution of thought. It might be redefined by the time the New Testament comes as the covenant people that are wicked. Okay. But nonetheless, like, cause I mean, if you look in Job, I personally don't necessarily think that Job, when he sends Satan, he's sending a man. I don't think he sends a man to cause the whirlwind. I think it might be some weird creature like a Leviathan. Okay. Leviathan this is something I listened to Dr. Price on with Old Testament, because they had a lot of folklore concepts, weird dragon concepts, things like that. Just check out a show with him sometime. I don't have a clue. I'm just pointing out what they said. And that's why I love doing what I'm doing. But Satan comes, and I'm like wrapping my head around this going, God did this. He literally is. And then God even shows up to the scene at the end. And he's like, who are you,
Who are you
oh
to
man?
question?
I am God. I send the lightning from and the animals to eat and snowflakes from heaven. Yeah. And like, you're like, if you really look at it now, it's like, oh, he really is in charge and causes the whole shenanigans to happen.
Yeah. So Job is interesting. There's an older version of it called The Righteous Sufferer, you may want to look into. And I believe that, like in ancient Near Eastern culture, they would take other people's stories and then rewrite them to be their own, and that's the flood narrative, the fall narrative. Anyway, so Job is, I believe, is that, and it's actually about Israel and the suffering that they were going through, and they were asking questions like, why do good things happen to bad people and bad to good? And they were asking those questions. Why are we suffering? Why are we being punished so much? The answer to the question was, don't question God. Who are you to question God? God thinks his ways are beyond our ways. It's like the 21st century version of answer that. And that's Job. To me, it's just a story. Did they take it literal? Some of them probably did, some of them didn't. I'm sure they were just as split as we are, on that stuff.
Dude, boils. I mean, like, by the time the fourth guy runs in the house, he's already got boils now starting to come on the scene. He's lost all his kids. His wife's screaming at him, blaming him.
Yeah.
Just too many things all that happened once. It does seem like what you're talking about. And there's probably some allegory here, speaking of other things. I mean, his
I would
whole
like to
house
ask
fell.
Yeah, I would like to ask the rabbi, what he, being a modern Jew, thinks of that, of that story, and how
He
does he read
probably
it in the
thinks
Hebrew?
it's really Job. And yeah,
Well, if it's since he's reading in the Hebrew, if it's written in poetry, and it's written in like a it's kind of a dance folkloric poetry, then maybe usually I don't know this for sure, but if I could read Hebrew and I would go in there and I would see that it's written in a certain poetic way, why would I take it serious? Why not take it as poetry? Because it's kind of written in that format. So I would like to ask him if that's the case, because that's beyond me, that kind of education. I don't know what that is yet. And then if that is the case, what his interpretation is, and why don't more people today know that that's just a story and that it's a story about Israel suffering. And
wow,
then I would
that's
like to ask him about as Adam is Israel. I would like to ask him about that too, that theory. And then, Adam's exile from the garden was Israel's exile from the promised land, in 586 BC. It was actually about that. So,
I think
yeah.
you're onto something here because Margaret Barker actually deals in temple theology, and what she does is very fascinating. I think if you look at Job's story that way, what you find is Job loses his children. What happens with Israel? Their children are scattered, right? It's this idea. But at the
Mm.
end, I always used to scratch my head at the end of that story and go, how did he give back his children? Like
He
what
got
did
new
he?
ones, right? Did you just get new
I
ones?
suspect if you take the narrative like, this really happened, but to me, it's interesting. What if this is prodigal son type material, if you will? The same narrative of like, I lost my son, but I not only got my son, I got more even back. I was blessed double. And he loses his house. Well, what's that other than the temple? Okay. He loses his land to foreigners. Well, what's that other
Uh,
than the land of Israel? I mean, a light bulb can go off really quick, and I could be in la la land trying to interpret this way, or I could be accurately saying Job is a narrative, a poetic narrative of Israel losing their temple, losing their land, losing their sons and daughters. Okay. And if they're faithful, even through the suffering of being conquered, at the end of the story, when the three men who are his friends, who are, why did you sin? Oh, you must have done. At the end of the story, God gives, after he speaks, he gives him, after he has said whatever he said, and all the lightning bolts and snowflakes and bumblebees and stuff, Job gets double. He literally gets twice. And I don't know. I think that could be a way to look at it.
mhm. Margaret Barker, is that who you said
Yeah,
wrote
if you
that?
have not
Okay.
read her, I'm going to tell you people who literally love her. Dr.
Yeah.
Price, Bart Ehrman, these are scholars who look to her Old Testament material. She is, and she's still a believer, but she's a liberal one. Okay, but you
Hmm.
you got to listen to her. I'm telling you, dude. A lot of people have recognized her temple theology stuff. Genesis creation goes into temple theology. I mean, it's this whole temple concept. So there are three layers to the temple, and there are three layers in the Genesis creation. There's separation, filling, and I believe it's resting is the third, and resting would be the Holy of Holies. But the separation and filling concept is days 1 and 4, 2 and 5, 3 and 6. You've got the land, you've water, land, and sky. And there's like some interesting stuff that she does with all of this throughout the Old Testament concepts and other books, but read her if you haven't.
Who would you recommend to read if I wanted to hear research on how other ancient Near Eastern cultures treated their mountains and temples and called them heavens and earth and new heavens, new earth, and that kind of language for their mountains and temples? And then I want to take that knowledge and then apply it to how Israel used for the same thing, their mountain and their temple.
I would ask Dr. Price that question. I couldn't answer. I remember years ago talking to J.L. Vaughn when I was a covenant creationist, and he equated these ancient tablets that predate the Old Testament, and he says this is actually Adam. So like he has a literal Adam view. Covenant creation a lot of times has a literal Adam view, not an allegorical Adam is Israel view, or some type of mythological type folklore, whatever you want to call it, view of Adam being Israel. But Dr. Price would be the person I would ask personally, because he would be able to easily show, hey, okay, so here's a culture, here's a book written by, he'll tell you a book to read, if not his own, where he might, in Holy Fable 1, I'm not sure because I haven't read it yet, he might mention this in that book, but I know for a fact he'll know people. In fact, Dr. Carrier, if you want to know chronology, if you want to know like when books might be written or arguments for the Old Testament concepts, even Dr. Carrier will say, ask Dr. Bob. Because Dr. Carrier is a Roman history guru. And not only does he have the whole Roman era down like a champ, if you want to know anything about Rome, just ask Dr. Carrier. He knows the scientist, he knows the science, he knows their liberal arts, he knows everything that Rome like was about. And he's very keen to that. I like to call Dr. Carrier the like, if you want to ask a question, he can give you a black or white answer. Like he's pretty good at not leaving it ambiguous and letting you really get as close to knowing what he means and saying what he means as possible. Dr. Bob, he can give you a 10-minute response and you'll finally go, so you just gave me 10 more questions that I have. You know what I mean? So I love it though. It's smart. I would ask him though, and I can ask him tomorrow at some point off air for you. So
Yeah,
definitely.
I want to do a series with you. We've spoken about this before, and I'm not sure if you would like to announce this here or not, but I want to
Yeah.
do a series with you guys asking just different scholars about hell questions and war language, fire war language, and stuff like that. Lake of Fire, where they got that, like just all kinds of different things about hell topics.
Right. Yeah, I definitely want to hear that. I'd like to entertain that, I could only imagine Dr. Bob's going to come in and say, well, where do I start?
Yeah,
Because
I saw him do an interview with a couple guys. It was he basically led it with, well, it doesn't exist in the Old Testament, and then in the New Testament it's kind of vague, and so if it's true, it's like good luck. It was just like, if that's the case, then good luck, because it didn't exist at all in the Old.
I've heard him talk about Zoroastrianism and how it is a major influence, that they had this idea of hell, and may had an influence possibly on the New Testament, but I'd like to probe him more. Just something I would be interested in doing. I don't know for certain though,
Mhm.
to be honest with you.